This is our friend Michael. Michael is unfortunately falling behind in his schoolwork, but he has his final exam in a couple of weeks. Looking at the calendar countdown, he wonders if it's still possible for him to do well, and feels angry at his past self for getting him to this stage. But what Michael doesn't realize is that this is something that happens to most of us sometime during our studies. And whatever the reason, know that you're not alone, and it's still possible to do well within short periods of time. Hey everyone, so that intro was based off me last semester in university, where I was behind 3 weeks in what we call a double subject. So imagine the workload of 2 subjects, but being combined into one, and then being behind in that. So not a good time. And I was falling behind to the stage that I scored around 60% for one of my mid-semester tests. And so that was way below my usual average, and I knew I had to make it up in my final exam. And looking back now at the things I did to catch up, it wasn't anything extraordinary like 10 hours a day, but it was still a lot of hard work. Because like everything, it comes down to not only effort, but also technique. And with the techniques that I'm going to cover in this video, I ended up bringing up my average to around the high 80s. And I'm not saying this is extremely impressive, but it's better than if I kept falling behind and I didn't have a recovery plan in place. And of course, falling behind is something that we want to avoid in the long term, but if we find ourselves in this situation, like I have many times, how can we salvage the situation and achieve the best possible outcome? This is what this video is going to cover. First thing when I was weeks behind was it's easy to let your emotions take the reins of control. So for example, panic, stress, regret, etc. But I found that the biggest enemy at this stage wasn't that essay that I had to write, but rather my own brain. Because our brain contains 2 key areas, our rational thinker and our reptile brain. Now, it is the reptile brain that powers the fight or flight response that you might know. So for example, in caveman times, it might be a lion trying to attack you. However, in the modern era, it can be a bit more subtle. The brain will try and protect you from any sort of discomfort, such as doing homework, by clouding your decisions with emotions or tempting you with procrastination. So we need to understand that the feelings of anger, regret, panic, they're only going to paralyze us and stop us from taking action. And honestly, this was the hardest step for me, overcoming this emotional barrier. But the good news is, after this has been overcome and the reptile brain has been shut off, our frontal cortex, or our rational thinker, takes over. And this is where higher level thinking and organizing begins to occur. And this is the first step to catch up when falling behind. Now it's time to start planning how to catch up. And I want to keep this part short, since ideally you don't want to spend hours forming the perfect timetable that almost breaks the fabrics of time. Instead, we just want to get started with a basic goal in mind. And the analogy that I'll use here is picture yourself going on a trip. There are 3 main things we need to consider. First, our starting point and destination. Second, what landmarks we are going to prioritize seeing along the way. And finally, what vehicle we are going to use on our trip. So for the first thing, the starting point represents how much content you know already. And the end point, or our destination, represents how much content we need to know. To determine these 2 points, it's good to go through what you know already, and then list out all the tasks that you need to do to get to your destination. And try to be specific, so don't write study maths. Instead, write do chapter 3 questions. And then for the second requirement on our list, each landmark basically represents a task that we need to do. So we have to choose which landmarks or which tasks we have to prioritize and which ones we have to spend more time on. And of course, we want to spend the most time on those high priority tasks. So those that are going to give us the greatest return for our time. And some examples include anything related to learning the content. And this is because we need to learn the content before doing practice essays or questions. Second, anything related to the dot points on the study design, because this shows you what explicitly is going to be tested. Any tasks related to understanding the content. So for example, watching YouTube videos, drawing mind maps, tables, or even summary notes to condense the key ideas into something you understand. And also tasks that your teachers have emphasized or discussed in class. And then on the flip side, anything that's low priority could include anything that won't be tested, areas that you are familiar with, and also practice questions, because you first need a solid foundation before you move on to practice questions. So that's why I put a little asterisk here. It's not that it's unimportant and you shouldn't do these, but rather there's an order in which we should do these things. And another tip to help you prioritize is to halve the amount of time that you have. For example, if I had 2 weeks to go before my exam, I would halve the amount of time that I have, so 1 week. And then I would say, what would I do differently, or what things would I do first if I only had 1 week to prepare? So asking these sort of questions help you truly find what is the most important thing for you to be doing. And for number 3, we need to make sure that we are traveling in the right vehicle. So are we crawling or going by car? So traveling by crawling is like studying while distracted. It's slow, inefficient, and makes you tired very quickly. Whereas traveling by car is studying with immense focus. And this is something known as deep work. And this allows you to maximize your study efficiency, even when you have little time. So this is basically a summary on how to achieve deep work. So remove distractions, pick a quiet study environment. I personally like music if the environment is quite loud. Longer study durations, so 60 to 90 minutes. Then take a break and repeat if necessary. And also make sure you're not hungry or tired before these longer study sessions. So take a rest beforehand if needed. And these 3 factors in our trip analogy are what I focus on whenever I am falling behind. So to summarize, first identify what you need to do. Second, prioritize those high quality tasks. And third, execute them with focus. So one common question that I see is, when I'm falling behind, should I try and stay up to date with the current work I am doing, or solely focus on catching up? And this is my take on it. So let's imagine we're baking a cake. If the base of the cake is burnt, there's no point putting icing on it and perfecting the decorations, because in the end, we have to redo the entire cake again. And by this I mean, if the current work that you are doing has something to do with the content taught a few weeks back that we haven't covered, it's important to cover those fundamentals first, before trying to catch up. Because it's likely that we're not going to fully understand what we've been taught, and we might have to relearn it again later on. So that just ends up wasting more time overall. But just know that if we cover the recovery plan mentioned before, we will be able to catch up at a rate that's faster than the content being taught. And the only exception I can think of is if the current work has no connection to the work that you've fallen behind on, then it's okay to keep up with your present work. So that is one tiny exception there. And if you're still feeling a bit despaired, know that going from a C to an A is relatively easier than going from an A to an A+. And so if you initially put in some time and effort to understand the basics and fundamentals of whatever topic you're learning, then you can already cover yourselves for the majority of things that will be tested. And this is known as the law of diminishing return. So those initial efforts we put in have the greatest return on our time. And the only barrier is just getting started. So that is it, and you probably don't need me saying this, but having a rough schedule and sticking to it to prevent cramming and falling behind is always going to be more effective. So prevention is better than the cure, as they say. But of course, life gets in the way sometimes. And if you do find yourself in a similar situation to me last semester, then I hope that these tips can guide you in the process that I took to boost my marks. And the sooner they are implemented, the better. Alright, take care.